My name is Brett Martin, president of CSA. We've got a good agenda for you today on beach renourishment. We've got a number of guests I'll introduce in a second. But first, I want to remind everybody that we are going to record this session. For those who could not be here, we'll be posting this on the website so that we have that information. Had several requests to get that out so we could get this information to all owners who could not be here for the holidays and those things that are going on. So with that, I'd like to start with just some introductions. We're going to go through our agenda, but we'll be talking about basically some information for you on the Beach Trust itself, how that got formed, what it is, what organization it's associated with, and all of those types of things. Victoria is going to talk a little bit about how the trust is set up financially, as well as the Forest Preserve Foundation, who is the owner of that land, of the trust property. And then we're going to have Scott Liggett and Chris Creed come up and talk about things that the town is planning on, what they've already done, and give you some ideas on what the future may look like for the dunes and the restoration out there. And then what we'll do is probably have Q&A for Scott and Chris. And then after they're done, we'll let them go, and we'll be back up here for any additional questions. So if you would, just hold your questions till the end when they finish their presentation, and then we'll go forward. So with that, I want to introduce David Henderson. He's going to come up and talk a little bit about the trust. David?
Thank you, Brett. A lot of you may be aware of the Beach Trust property, and others may not, but we thought just to set the stage for this discussion, because it is relevant to what happened as a result of Hurricane Matthew, I'd just take a couple minutes to explain to you a little bit of historical information with the trust. The Beach Trust property, it's about 165 acres, was conveyed in 2000 by gift deed from the Sea Pines Land Company to the Sea Pines Forest Preserve Foundation. Now, this was a direct result of the 1999 Property Research Holdings litigation. And if you're not familiar with that litigation, essentially there was unclear title or claim to title for all open space areas within Sea Pines, to include what you think of as open space, also to include utility easements, beach walkways, the Beach Trust. And as a result of that settlement agreement, the Beach Trust property was ultimately conveyed in 2000 to the Sea Pines Forest Preserve Foundation. What it is, it's that strip of land, and it does vary in length and width depending on where you are, that exists between the seaward property lines of those oceanfront parcels and the mean high water line of the Atlantic Ocean. And it extends through all of Atlantic Ocean frontages and Sea Pines, so that's from Canvasback Road all the way to Sound Villas. The use and access of the Beach Trust policy, of the Beach Trust property, is governed by policy established by the trustees of the Sea Pines Forest Preserve Foundation. I have one more slide I wanted to go over next, Amanda. That's okay. So the Forest Preserve has spent some funds as a result of Hurricane Matthew in the Beach Trust, and those funds have been used to remove debris that was in the Beach Trust along our full Atlantic frontages. This included both vegetative debris and non-natural or construction debris, docks and other things that left debris behind. We needed to do that. For one, it was a safety issue, lots of nails and screws and hardware and things that were not safe for people to be at. But we also needed to do it to prepare for some work that the town has done and will be doing. And then there's also obviously the aesthetic concerns, but we have done that. A little bit of history on where that money came from is that Hurricane David in 1979 narrowly missed Sea Pines. And keep in mind at this time that there was no CSA, there was no town, and essentially a group of concerned Sea Pines property owners recognized, wow, we dodged a bullet, but what if we didn't dodge the bullet? Who is going to restore our beach? Who's going to take care of our beach and clean up our beach? And so ASPO at that time formed a beach committee in 1981 and solicited voluntary contributions from all property owners in Sea Pines, commercial and residential. That fund that was resulted from those voluntary contributions is essentially what is the source up to this point of the funds that we've used. The Sea Pines Coastal Conservancy was formally established in 1982, again, pre-town. And they were a South Carolina Symmetry corporation that generally promoted the safety and welfare of sea pines residents through the protection of the topography and ecology of the coastline. Well, that organization, again, since it was incorporated until when they dissolved in 1996, a lot of things have come along. The town was formed, CSA was formed, town was doing beach renourishment, sea turtle monitoring and protection. A lot of those things that they were looking to do, other entities had developed and to take that over. So they dissolved in 1996 and transferred all the funds that they had in that time to the Sea Pines Forest Preserve Foundation, which is a 501c3. Currently, there is no mechanism in place for an ongoing funding source. So the funds that have been used and the little that remain, and Victoria will talk about that, were all a result of the work that had been done previously by the Beach Committee and the Sea Pines Coastal Conservancy. The use of those funds that were transferred were restricted to beach and dune related activities, and they have sat untouched in the Forest Preserve's books, if you will, since 1996 until just recently, when we've spent the majority of that money on the cleanup associated with Hurricane Matthew. So with that brief background,
I don't even think I have a slide. Unfortunately, what I have to say is short and sweet and not the best answer. There was approximately, as before the storm, $123,000 in that beach trust, which is restricted in our fund balance. We have to date spent $107,137 on beach cleanup. If anybody wanted to get copies of those invoices, I'm more than happy to share that with you. So that leaves us with $16,000. That's where we stand. Like I said, it's not the best news, but it is what it is.
Just a quick comment on the topic of funds. Traditionally, just so everybody in the room knows, CSA has not funded either the Forest Preserve or the Beach Trust. Those funds have been set aside or self-earned, if you will. So those contributions, if you've looked at the numbers that we've been using for CSA, none of those numbers in our forecast of expenses related to Matthew include the Beach Trust or the Forest Preserve. Those are all, they're separate entities, they're affiliated. We have the same executive group that runs the trust. They are the trustees. That's the CSA Executive Committee, but it is a separate entity and it is self-contained within itself as a separate entity. So I want to make sure everybody has a little background on that so we can go into Q&A a little bit later. But with that, I'd like to introduce Scott Liggett, and Scott will come up and talk about all the things that the town has been doing and maybe be able to do in the future. Scott?
Gotcha. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here. Merry Christmas to everybody. Let me start by recognizing and thanking both Brett's efforts and David's, and I'm sure I'm telling you something that you already realize, that their efforts here in the post-storm environment have been instrumental across a lot of different fronts, not the least of which is the beach program. You know, their efforts to date have facilitated and allowed the town to pursue and coordinate a handful of work that has gone on here in and around Sea Pines, and I'm happy to be here to share the response to date that the town has taken. To date, in response to the storm, we've incurred about $3 million of an additional cost to date out of pocket related to the beach. The vast majority of that, I will tell you, has indirect and direct benefits to Sea Pines. And as the talk here goes on today, I think we'll have an opportunity to outline for you all what we have been doing. And speaking of that, I would like to also not only share with you what we have been doing, but why. There has been kind of a method to the madness, if it hasn't been apparent to folks, but to try to outline for everybody the prioritization that has gone on, a triage of sorts that has helped our decision making and recommendations thus far. I'm happy to detail for everybody kind of the immediate steps that we are taking, the intermediate and the more long distant or long term program approach, kind of what's our trajectory. Similarly, we may be able to detail today, or at least make mention of those action items that may fall or be joined by CSA and any of the adjacent stakeholder property owners when we look ahead. Realizing that the interest here today, I'm sure, is the Sea Pines Beach, but we can't really ignore the rest of the island's beach. We manage it as a system, and so you're going to hear some parts of our talk bringing in other areas outside of Sea Pines, because I think it's important to do that. And the last thing, insofar as introductory remarks, you'll hear me today speak in subjective terms, occasionally good, bad, better, worse. While I have the data that I think supports those kind of descriptors, what I'm speaking of, or please take it in the context of this: wider beach is a better beach. A narrower beach is a worse beach. Taller dunes are better. Lower dunes are worse. And so we've got some graphs to show, but that's kind of the mindset of what I'm speaking of. So to bring everybody up to speed where we were the night before the storm, we actually were underway with our 2016 project, which was the third scheduled renourishment here since 1990. And as you all may remember seeing that work adjacent to Tower Beach Club and South Beach, we had left Sea Pines in August or so, but South Beach and Port Royal, Fish Hall area, Mitchellville area was also renourished as part of this effort. And what we have chosen to do through time, including here, was to try to replicate or be mindful of those conditions that had occurred since 2007, which was the last time that we had constructed this project. We don't have a program where the beach is expected to be continually wider, and this project is going to make it even wider than the last one, and the next project even wider still. So we're kind of in a maintenance mode going forward with it with respect to our beach program. The red and the yellow represent those parts of the shoreline that we have previously renourished, and you'll note there towards what would otherwise be the toe of the island, the red and the yellow that depict the previous actions there at South Beach, the yellow area being the most recent action that we undertook here this past summer. So this is where I was, and again, probably no surprise to anybody, the areas that we have historically renourished seem to continually need renourishment, and we'll get into a discussion here a little bit later. There is a similar judgment that is made or has been made historically where we don't place sand. There's rationale for why we choose to place it and why we have historically not chosen to place it that we'll get into here in a couple of minutes. With respect to the results of the project, this was actually an aerial photograph that was taken as the project in 2007 was being finished. You'll note the Sonesta Resort there, kind of middle center of the photograph. We're advancing to the north towards Palmetto Dunes, but this is mostly a shot over the top of North Forest Beach. Some things to reference: that the yellow dashed line represents the pre-1990 shoreline. So that was the position of the beach prior to our first effort. And for most folks that maybe have moved here since 1990, the history, I think, is important to understand. And these are a couple of photos that show, frankly, what is still in place today on North Forest Beach. We had about 10,000 feet of that shoreline, so about 2 miles, that was revetted. We had about 15 feet of rocks and boulders that protected that shoreline. The best that most beachgoers could expect there was to walk through ankle-deep water at low tide. We had virtually no dry beach at low tide, and since that time we've kind of scraped ourselves up to where we are today, on average the beach being about 200 feet wider now than it was back then. With respect to our project and these limits, you may ask yourself, how do you know exactly what the position of the beach was in advance of any of these projects? Since 1986, the town has had a semi-annual survey program where we go out and take survey locations along 70 or so of these lines that are represented here on this graphic. So we go out with real live surveying equipment, measure the position of the profile, and are able to understand how that beach is moving or not within any particular time frame. One of the discussions that has emerged here most specifically post-Matthew has been a discussion of performance and conditions along the central part of what I would describe as the Sea Pines shoreline, mostly between, let's say, Marsh Wren and the Beach Lagoon area, the area that many of you have seen photographs of that was so heavily damaged. What our survey information tells us is that, again, the night before that storm, the beach and the dunes there were never better than they were that night. The beach was as wide as it was in our 30-year history. The dunes were as tall as they were in our 30-year history. And frankly, going back to the time of available aerial photography back to the mid-50s, we have not been able to demonstrate conditions that were better going back 30 years hence. And so one of the seeds I would like to plant for you is that realizing that we had the high water mark, the best conditions that we ever had out there, is it reasonable to think that will become the standard against which all future conditions are measured, particularly as it relates to either an overnight or a quick response from the town, from CSA, from each of you as individual property owners. It took us 30 years to get here. And how quickly we recover, we would like to recover, but I would suggest it's a tall order, almost unfillable, to expect that we're going to return overnight to those sorts of conditions. As it relates to our project and the design, what I'd like to try to replicate here for you, as you see the colored lines, those represent excerpts that we have taken out of our surveying database. Each of them corresponds to a particular point in time, and you'll see, general advancement and retreat in most locations. The beach comes and goes. It's very dynamic, as you would expect. Based on that survey information that we collect and the desire to maintain a minimum beach condition, which in this graphic is represented by that heavy red line, we develop what we call a design template. The black dashed line that you see there, whereby we come in historically every 8 to 10 years, place sand in the shape that's located there, and then essentially let that project be redistributed, erode, accrete as the forces necessarily dictate. With respect to these decisions that we make, there are really 3 performance indicators in particular that guide the decision making. One, which is how wide is the beach? 2, from a volumetric standpoint, how much sand per foot of beach have we lost in the time period that we're looking at? And the 3rd performance indicator is how quickly is that shoreline either retreating or advancing? So all 3 of those things play into the decision to recommend that we place sand or not place sand. Which leads us to this graph, which I realize is quite busy, and I don't expect any of you to necessarily take anything from this, but please know that those are the 3 performance indicators that we are monitoring, and I would call your attention particularly to the top of this particular graphic. You'll note the areas in red are those locations where we have, relatively speaking, narrow beach widths. Some might be coupled with an erosional signal, which could be a problem, but also note there at the central part of Sea Pines, we have generally narrow beach widths, but no appreciable change, no erosion, and in fact what we have seen through time is mostly an accretional signal. So what we do is try to marry locations where we have at least 2 of these 3 performance indicators being a concern, in many areas all 3 of them. And what this does is create a graphic here. You'll recall the area, the map that we were having trouble with earlier. We had areas in yellow that were shown where we had placed sand. Similarly, this frames up those areas in yellow where we place sand. And again, you'll note, particularly looking at the top of the screen, many of these areas have at least 2, and in some cases 3 of these performance indicators thought as being problematic and worthy of the town's intervention. And again, just as a reminder, you'll note again the gaps here. The gap there between South Forest Beach and the toe of the island has never received any sand, although it has generally been accretional in our monitoring cycle. And you'll also note the gap during this cycle north of the folly up towards the heel in the west end. There was no sand recommended for placement there, mostly because the beach was wider here in the run-up to this project than it was when we finished the 2007 project. So we do try to be very judicious with the placement of our sand. So with all of that, Hurricane Matthew comes along. Many of you that have seen the beach probably not necessarily surprised by any of these statistics. Pretty extensive coastal flooding, the highest flat water surface elevation ever recorded over at the gauging station at Fort Pulaski at the Savannah River. It actually went offline overnight, Friday night, the 7th into the 8th, because of those high water events. The south end of the island here, in addition to that high water level, we also had about 19 inches of rainfall. And so, there was something that had to give as it relates to storm surge, particularly high water levels of our receiving water bodies, and the rainfall event that we were trying to discharge, as well as the storm surge we were trying to do away with. We did have extensive frontal dune loss across most parts of the island, although there were definitely differences along the 13 or so miles of shoreline as it relates to the dune response. Some, we think, as a result of the orientation of the shoreline, the passage and timing of the storm, where the high tide was at any given time, where the predominant winds were that may have tended to thrust more water to those shorelines. So the damage was far from equally distributed. The primary dune was breached in many locations, particularly outside of the areas that we had previously filled. And you can see the estimated losses, which are preliminary at this point, but about 750,000 cubic yards of sand moved around as a result of the storm. And to frame that up, the project that we are currently building involves the placement of about 2 million cubic yards. So you're talking about a third of the volume of the whole project that has taken us 6 months to build, being moved around in about 12 hours. Really kind of amazing. With respect to the damages, I'd mentioned that they were not equally distributed, and this is a graphic that is meant to try to identify where we had issues. Starting there at the central part of the island, North and South Forest Beach, from our project standpoint, had been completed before the storm hit. There were damages that we incurred there that we were concerned if we didn't repair them, that there may be longer term impacts to the downdrift areas that include sea pines. So the town chose to rebuild those sections that were previously nourished. The area in Palmetto Dunes where we are currently working sustained damage, and what we have chosen to do there is basically replace a volume of sand that equates to the storm-related losses. So to the end user, the beach is not going to look any different, but we are placing more sand there because the beach was lower than it would have otherwise been had the storm passed. As I mentioned, we had dune breaches there on the south end. Many of you that have been to the beach or have oceanfront property no doubt noticed one of the prevailing situations that existed island-wide was that many of these at-grade foot accesses, the pedestrian accesses, served as a vehicle either for storm surge inflow or outflow, and there were many channels that were incised in the face of the beach, the drainage ditches, that we have meant to correct. We had some areas on the island more to the north here of Sea Pines where the crest of the dune was not breached by the storm surge. We did have the front face of the dunes eroded and heavily scarped, but the dunes themselves were still relatively intact. The areas in and around Sea Pines, many areas, the storm surge just rolled in and planed the dunes off just like a bread knife, just cut them flat as a slope, and the beach is recovering ever since. But my point of this slide is that the damages that we sustained are different, and our response accordingly has been different. But clear in a way, the area, as I mentioned earlier, from Marsh Run to Beach Lagoon, to my mind, right now is the most vulnerable post-storm, and the area that we are focused a fair bit on trying to repair. I won't detail all of these. I'll let you go ahead and kind of read through this. The days following the storm, I think, were busy for everybody, and this is a categorization of what we have been trying to do just as it relates to the shorefront and the beach items here. I'd mentioned earlier the dune breaches that were formed. Really one of the first thing we did because of the threat that was associated with the pending spring tides. We had made arrangements to close those breaches starting there on mid-October. I think 14th to the 18th is what is identified. There were about 25 breaches from Braddock Cove all the way around to Coligny that were closed as part of that work. We moved and transitioned From there to the emergency berm construction in and around marsh wren, gray widgeon, and piping plover in particular, but also heading northward. That work was completed here a couple of weeks ago, but in the run-up to that work, we had design and permitting activities to undertake, but that was kind of the second item on our list of priorities that we were choosing to advance, trying to address the vulnerability that existed down there. And the third piece of it that we're currently advancing, many of you that are adjacent owners in that area will soon be receiving public notice. We filed an application here a couple of weeks ago seeking to place sand along that part of Sea Pines, roughly from Bald Eagle all the way to the South Beach Lagoon, each Beach Lagoon intersection, seeking a permit modification that would allow us, hopefully, later on this winter into early spring, come in and try to replace a volume of sand that was lost there. And so that thus far has been the hierarchy. Also, please realize that we're also working from a technical standpoint. Chris and his firm completed a preliminary damage assessment. Literally the day after the storm, we put in the call to them to come up. We had sustained sufficient damage that their expertise was required. They have completed that initial assessment that also speaks to the need for a more robust and complex engineering analysis, which is ongoing. We do expect the results of that work in within the next month or so, middle of January, that may set the stage for what the town might do next beyond what I've outlined here today. So any work we undertake this spring may not be the end of it for us or for you or for CSA. To continue to try to tell the story, we've pulled some slides together, realizing that many of the calls, let's say, that I have been receiving really are now dealing with the scoping of this project that we're trying to advance. And I want to try to walk you guys down the beach from South Forest Beach area, Caligny area, down to Bald Eagle, down to South Beach Lane. And these two photographs, the bottom photograph is recent, from the spring of this year. The top photograph is from 1994, so 22 years, 23 years between these aerial photographs. You may note on the top of the screen, we don't have a laser pointer, do we? Uh-oh, I don't want to touch anything now. What we've tried to do in this top slide is denote the line of vegetation, okay? And to orient you, Caligny Circle is here. This is the Grand Ocean Resort. The Ocean Gate of Sea Pines is off the screen to the left. So the green is where the vegetation was in 1994. The bottom slide from 2016 shows the vegetation line of this spring. So the difference between these two lines is the advancement, the growth of vegetation that has occurred in the last 22 years. So from 94 to 2016. And you'll see this area that was sand is now vegetated, okay? So the beach has gotten better. We think largely because of the continued sand supply that the town has provided. Yes, sir. Let me just use, there we go. Let me call your attention to these numbers. A little bit harder to read in this. I mentioned earlier the 60 or 70 or so monitoring stations. Those are just numbered sequentially around the island. So as we advance these photographs, we're going to go in descending order. The area in question within Sea Pines is monitoring station 4 through 9. So we're up here at 12 and 11. The other thing, if those of you that more heavily rely on the town's beach markers, the white posts that are spaced every 1/10 of a mile or so, that's what we have here along the bottom. But this is going to be more important in my remarks here. We're at 12 and 11, and we're heading south, okay?
Our southern limit of past nourishment has never been south of
Every project has terminated here, mostly in front of the Grand Ocean Resort.
So if I understand what you're saying is that large expanse of beach that is primarily represents the Sea Pines beach, that really has never been renourished.
Yeah, we have chosen to manage that indirectly, let's say. It functions downdrift from the shoreline where we have directly placed sand. Back in the mid-'80s, when the town developed its initial understanding and sediment budgets for the island, we came to understand that sand for the south end of the island generally was moved in that direction from points to the north. And so by placing sand in and around, for instance, South Forest Beach, North Forest Beach, the forces that are still at play here today after the storm naturally want to move that sand into the Sea Pines area. And so that's how we have been able to maintain that minimum beach condition, by placing sand updrift and letting it move. With respect to our location, monitoring station 10 here, 9 is internal to Sea Pines, roughly associated with Green Heron Street, one of the oceanfront streets there along North Sea Pines Drive. Monitoring station number 8 is adjacent to Laughing Gull, so a little bit south. Much like in the prior photograph, you'll notice the 1994 vegetation line here in green, the 2016 vegetation line in 16 with red, and so the balance, again, we have seen substantial and consistent accretion along this part of the Sea Pines shoreline as well. So there's a common theme to the story here. This is in and around the Sea Pines Beach Club, the Marriott's Turtle Lane property. This is the Beach Lagoon neighborhood here. Again, same story. Green represents the line in 94. Red represents the line in 2016. So again, you have seen conditions of late that have continued to improve. More sand in the system. The beach has grown wider. The dunes have gotten better. The other thing that I would call your attention to, if you'll recall on the prior slides, the relative width of the growth. Some areas it's been pretty robust, where we've seen 100 or more feet of seaward advancement of that line. But you'll begin to detect in this slide a narrowing. You'll compare this distance with this distance. The beach is still stable, but it is not necessarily grown or has not been accreting at the same pace as the beach to the north. Beach monitoring station 5 and 4. 5 is roughly located adjacent to Surf Scoter, and monitoring station 4 is adjacent to Mark. Same nomenclature with the coloration of the lines, but again, the relative positions of these two lines is much more obvious here. There just has not been a lot of separation, not as much dune growth in this area. It has been a stable, relatively healthy system, but not near as apt to grow, does not appear to be near as dynamic in this particular area as the other areas that we are seeing. And so what does all of this mean as it relates to our intended course of action here for the placement of sand? This is a excerpt from our data set, the slice that we have taken through the beach. If you were to go out there with a knife, slice the beach in half, and then pick it up on edge and look at it. What you see here in this slide are the relative positions of the shoreline through time, the solid black line being 1986, so mid-'80s positions. And with each color advancement, you'll note we bump forward about 5 years or so. So we've got red to blue to green to purple. And so this is a depiction through the last 30 years that shows the continual advancement of that beach. The black dashed line represents the post-storm conditions. We have been and surveyed the beach since the storm completely. And so as much change as we have had, the beach, quite frankly, really is no worse now than it was in 2007. So if we didn't respond in 2007 to those conditions, help me understand the justification to respond now, because we would have to get permits to do anything here. So we've drawn the conclusion that this area, although it has changed, but change doesn't constitute damage that we necessarily need to intervene with. Moving south, this is monitoring station 8 in and around Laughing Gull. I maybe should also make mention, although we don't have the tide lines located, mean high water comes in just less than elevation 4. So keep in mind, high water line comes in here. This is all area above the high water line, the dry berm and the dunes. The area to the right of the slide is the below water part of the profile. But again, you'll notice the heavy black line, again, the coloration of lines. The purple is where we were last spring. But again, at monitoring station 8, we have conditions here that mostly replicate the condition of the beach in 2007. So mostly good news for the folks in and around that area. Let's contrast that with what's going on at the south end of our project, in and around marsh wren, gray widgeon, and piping plover. Same nomenclature. You'll notice that the lines, the colored lines, are all very tightly spaced. This correlates to the space between the green and red lines on my prior slides, where you'll note that there wasn't much movement historically in those two positions in 20 years. The slices through the beach here also support that we haven't had a lot of growth here. You'll note the dune that at this point was prominent here, but take a look at the black dashed line. This represents post-storm conditions. So what we have here at Marsh Wren are beach conditions that are worse than we have ever seen in the history of our monitoring, worse than we have ever seen in the history of our aerial photography inventory that goes back to 1955. So I would suggest this is a reason why you're seeing the level of activity that you have insofar as our immediate response to address that berm which has been completed and to advance that fill project starting here at the south end of the project and moving to the north. This is a graphic example of the conditions here, both a couple of years ago, early February, that shows this particular house, and this is at Gray Widgeon. This is the CSA access that runs between Gray Widgeon and Marsh Wren. Take a look at the relative positions. Again, these lines are shown in the same location. Note the orientation of the swimming pools here as well. And this is the post-storm aerial photography that was taken a couple of days after the event. You'll notice that the entire buffer, the entire dune system is gone. We've got pools that have been eroded to the point that they are now on the active beach, and we have active beach that is contained within private property. All of which are of concern, I think, to all of the stakeholders. A couple of other signals that I would draw your attention to here. You'll note the difference in coloration in the swimming pools, the bright blue versus the less bright blue. And the conclusion that I'm drawing here is that we had storm surge, literal storm surge and seawater into those swimming pools to give you a sense of maybe how bad conditions had gotten here during the height of the storm. But this is a call to action to my mind. Moving a little bit to the north, monitoring station 5. This is at Surf Scoter. Again, you'll notice the tightly bunched colored lines here that represent those beach profiles through time. And again, the black dashed line representing the post-storm conditions. And again, at Surf Scoter, about 3,000 feet north of Marsh Wren, we have conditions that are as bad as we have ever seen. In fact, have never seen conditions this bad. So if you follow along with what I'm trying to suggest, that the project definitely needs to start as far south as Marsh Wren and continue at least as far north as Surf Scoter. That's what the survey information is telling us, that we've got a vulnerability there that we would like to try to address that we have not previously seen. When you move up to monitoring station 6, and this is adjacent to South Beach Lagoon, again, you've got the colored lines here that represent positions through time. Becomes a little less clear how the post-storm condition compares to conditions that we may have seen previously. There's a little bit of confusion in those lines, a little bit of overlap, but what I would suggest here is that we have seen these conditions before. Admittedly, you may have to go back in time to, say, the early 90s when those sort of conditions existed, but as we move north, things are generally improving, or at least haven't been damaged as significantly. The last slide that I'm going to show you, and this is at monitoring station 7, which is literally there at the Sea Pines Beach Club. Again, you start to see a signal that replicates the monitoring stations that I started with at 8 and 9, where while we have had change in the beach, we've got conditions that are clearly different than our high water mark when you compare the purple with the dashed lines. Clearly, we have experienced worse conditions, and in fact, for the majority of the town's monitoring period, we have had worse conditions out there than we have out there today. So ever how you want to slice this up, what I would suggest to you is that the project limits need to start as far south as I'd made mention of at Bald Eagle, but how far north we go, which seems to be the point of contention. From an engineering standpoint, what I would suggest is that the data supports the notion that we fill beyond monitoring station 6, but once we get into monitoring station 7 here at the Beach Club, I think it becomes difficult to defend a decision why one would do that. And so we've got a difference or a disparity in the conditions, and that's what has driven the decisions to this point to kind of frame up the project. Realizing that in all of the permitting that goes on, to include acknowledgement by FEMA if we are so successful to claim an eligible project, funding that goes along with this, and our ability to defend a decision that this is in fact damage that's caused by the storm. But we're trying to manage both a quick permitting of this project, i.e. that we are responding to emergency conditions as opposed to responding to conditions that existed just 10 years ago. We're trying to manage the resource that is the sand. We're trying to manage the cost. And so thus far, this is the recommendation that has been put forth, and there may be some additional commentary that comes either from within the community, from CSA, may necessarily involve town council if there are those that think that some sort of political intervention is necessary. Let me do this, and you may have some additional remarks, Chris, to provide here on this slide. I know it's busy with a lot of numbers, but what I wanted to draw out particularly, and this is the 700,000 cubic yards of change number that I'd spoken to earlier, and how unequally it was distributed across the island. And quite frankly, if you were to look at 3 areas in particular, the vast majority of the sand that has been moved from the island's beach has occurred within these 3 areas. Those shown in green are essentially confined to the limits of our active project where we are currently working. And so we'll address that project just in the course of executing the project. The flyer here at the south end, the South Beach Lane project, between those monitoring stations that I was describing, 4 to 6, you see a significant amount of sand moving out of that area. And again, this is what justifies that response. When you get right down to it, we've got much less numbers moving through the other monitoring stations of the island. Again, more substantiation that the damage was not equally distributed. Getting towards the last of the slides here, this is actually a schematic that represents the permit application that has been filed as of a couple of weeks ago. So we are actively seeking a permit to place the sand here, as I'd mentioned, roughly between Bald Eagle here on the south end, and we've also identified the monitoring stations here as prominently as we can. Monitoring station 4 at Marsh Wren, monitoring station 5 there at Surf Scoter. As you advance to the north, monitoring station 6 here along South Beach Lagoon. You'll note the limits of the project here roughly at the East Beach Lagoon, South Beach Lagoon intersection. And this is monitoring station 7 at the Beach Club. And so the discussions that I have been pulled into most recently involve the interests here to the north or outside of the project limits about any potential to expand that project to the north. And in simple terms, I don't believe that there is an engineering justification to do that. There may be other reasons that that is thought to be necessary, but it just doesn't have its roots in our management approach to date. So this is what we are seeking a permit to construct. Hopefully we're able to get those permits and make contractual arrangements such that that can advance here later on this winter into this spring. I think that gets me to the end of my slides. I'm happy if there's time to take any questions, but thank you all for the opportunity.
Thank you, Scott. Just a quick reminder, and Scott, why don't you stay up here because I think we will have a few questions. Wait for either Amanda or David to get a microphone to you so we can record the question as well as the answer.
When the renourishment is finished, what type of ground rules will there be for rebuilding beach walks?
You know, that's an interesting discussion that has turned or potentially turned into, from the staff perspective, to one of the policy items that town council may want to take up. To date, the town doesn't have any local regulations that necessarily guide what happens there as it relates to those walkways. We do heavily rely on the state to provide that guidance. And the question that I have, maybe not so rhetorically, if there is concern that anybody has about those at-grade walkways, allowing storm surge to penetrate the dune and potentially compromise the dune field and or that private property, we should contemplate as a community the potential to provide or require elevated walkways wherever and whenever they're necessary. That, though, comes at a cost, both to the folks that are constructing those walkways. It also has the potential to come at a cost should we have another storm and we have many more miles of boardwalk, decking, and that sort of thing that could become dislodged. But I would suggest to you that it's a potential policy discussion for council if we want to essentially regulate or require that to happen. And it's also maybe worthwhile to note that where these dunes move, they accrete and they recede. If we have walkways that are built that maybe are elevated over the dune at the time they are constructed, is the walkway owner or builder required to extend that walkway if the dunes grow? Are they required to remove it if it retreats? It's a little bit complicated. It's one of those things that we have set aside for now and intend to, I guess, more fully advance it as winter approaches and into spring. For now, for any of you folks that are working within our project limits, my advice would be to spend the least that you can to ensure that you have safe access to the beach, and let staff and or council, if necessary, kind of take up that matter. And I think that's consistent thus far with the guidance that has come from CSA.
Is there any information on the Land's End area? Is that got nothing to do with the ocean part since it goes up Calabogie?
No, we have monitoring stations that extend all the way from the groin there at Land's End at the entrance to Baynard and Braddock Cove. We've got monitoring stations that run all the way there. I wasn't prepared today to detail what has occurred there, but we've had universal recession. I mean, we've lost on the order of 40 feet or so. On the Calabogie Sound side, that beach has gotten much narrower as a result of the storm. But we've got all of that data.
Thanks.
A couple of quick things. First of all, is there a plan as part of the Renourishment to actually replant vegetation in dunes?
We have asked ourselves the question. We don't have an answer yet. Right now, restoration of the dunes, whether it be through fencing or planting or a combination of the two, is something that I think would be beneficial. Right now, it's of lower priority for us than the actual placement of sand in the areas that I've spoken of before. But that's one of the discussion items going forward, is a response as it relates to things that may facilitate a quicker recovery of the dunes, something that the town wants to consider, something that we may partner with groups like CSA, the POA and Palmetto Dunes, Port Royal and the like. It also is something that many adjacent private property owners can pursue. One point I would make is that don't necessarily think you have to rely on the town to do that sort of thing. There are discussions, permits that can occur with any individual private property owner. The only thing that I would suggest for those of you that may be living adjacent to our project limits or our proposed project limits, I wouldn't recommend you advance any planting or fencing within that footprint because it's likely going to be disrupted by the project. But if you have interest, let's say north of the beach club, that may be an opportunity for those of you that have an interest there to move ahead almost immediately with a private fencing or wait for the town's guidance in that regard. But yeah, I'm expecting that we're going to advance a project. I just don't know the full scope of it yet.
And secondly, the fact that the area between the property owner line and the mean high water line is owned by this other entity, the Beach Trust, does that have any impact on cost allocation of any of the renourishment projects?
No, it has no cost allocation implications. It creates a different legal, it's not even a challenge because everybody that we've worked with has been more than cooperative, but there are easements that we secure from adjacent private property owners to prevent the expansion or the extension seaward of those property lines. The state law here in South Carolina would otherwise let that happen. And we simply don't want people following us seaward. We want to build the beach. We want it to serve as a buffer. We want it to serve as a recreational amenity. We want it to serve as have habitat, but we don't want it built upon. We don't want it encroached upon. We don't want to create an environment where the demands for service in that regard are increased.
Do we have any,
Hey, Becky.
do we have any answer from Weeks Marine if they're going to stay around?
We are awaiting a response from Weeks. We had asked that they provide us a proposal to build the project that I've tried to describe here, the placement of about 250,000 cubic yards of sand. They are working now, as I'd mentioned, finishing the project in Palmetto Dunes. You know, they've got plans to go elsewhere. They've got other contractual obligations. They run into a batch of heavy weather here of late, but I'm awaiting a response from them. And if we don't get a response, or they send a signal that they don't intend to provide a proposal to us, then we'll be forced to likely release just a regular solicitation and go through the competitive process to make that happen. So we're hopeful that they will offer. It would make things a lot easier, better, arguably cheaper for the town, because they would likely leave equipment here, some equipment, if they were to go away and then come back. So it would be advantageous to everybody if we can make that happen. But the ball's in their court.
Living on Marsh Wren, I want to thank all of you all that truly helped to get us sort of back in order. It was a great help. A couple of questions. David, I think for you, Henderson, the $107,000 that was spent on cleanup, 3 streets, Marsh Wren, Gray Widgeon, and Piping Plover, we all paid $1,200 for cleanup. Were we different than the rest of the property owners in Sea Pines?
Well, basically what's happened at those properties is because of the erosion actually occurred on your property, and it went well inside of your property line. So a couple things needed to happen. One is that area needed to be cleaned up, and then we also needed an agreement from all those property owners to allow the town to come in and place sand in that property. That did not occur anywhere else. We neither needed the property owner to clean their property up or get an agreement with the town for other properties, with I think a couple exceptions for the just the feathering that was done at the end of the berms, but there was no cleanup required of those properties. So basically what's happened is everybody pays for their own cleanup. So each individual property owner who is a residential property owner with oceanfront that was escarped, if you will, or had erosion on their property paid for their own cleanup. Everybody else didn't have to pay for it because they didn't need it. So the beach trust picked up the rest of it for all of the beach area. Does that make sense?
So basically, it was within our own property.
That's correct. That's the only fee that was paid by those owners.
Okay, the other thing has to do with just really a question. The sand that came up to provide our dune, I can't see. What I see happening now is the walkway was extended this morning. The walkway to the beach between Marsh Wren and Gray Widgeon, they put steps on the walkway today. Now, those steps come right at the beginning of the dune where the sand has been put right up to our yards. And what happens is everybody walks their dogs. They bring chairs down and sit on what they think is now the beach, but it's really the dunes. Children play on those dunes and go up and down. Are the dunes fragile? I mean, does it matter, or should we be either fencing those areas to get people to go all the way down to what would be the beach?
Well, there's been a discussion of a variety of different topics, and I'll let Scott speak to some of these ideas as well, is that we really want people to get down there, but we don't want you to build a boardwalk, obviously, until the final project is done. So people are going to walk. Whether or not that will be restored as part of this project, at least some of that will be placed in that walkway that may occur there. Those areas above where the walkway, where the existing new and Scott, I'll let you talk a little bit about this, where the existing new platform, if you will, is.
Yes, the new sand.
I don't
Right.
believe the new sand is going to cover that again. So it would be appropriate to build beach walks out to that level, okay, and then go down to the beach from there. Does that make sense? We'll have to show a graphic. It probably doesn't sound, it will be.
It's what's happening now, though.
The people are walking as they do on the beach. You know, I've talked to a few property owners. You're certainly free to put no trespassing signs on your property, as we've talked about in the past. We've discussed the opportunity to put no trespassing signs in areas up to that for the beach trust. However, again, we are going to have additional work being done down there in the near future, we hope. So that discussion is occurring.
So I could put private, whatever.
No trespassing, private property on your
both
property line.
sides where they're, because they're basically walking in your yard. I
Yeah,
mean,
on your
they're
property,
right-
absolutely.
They're right with you.
Right, right. Yes, sir. Just one second. Let's get a microphone. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just a quick question, a couple of them. Is the funding secure for this Renourishment in Sea Pines?
Short answer is yes.
So that project is green light, it's going to happen?
The project is going to happen. You know, we are working under a couple of different funding opportunities. The town had, before the storm, a $13 million beach renourishment fund reserve. And so we will rely on that for our share of what we hope is a potentially reimbursable project from FEMA. But at this point, the funding is secure and we are advancing the project. I was in a meeting for a couple hours here this morning with the FEMA beach team. There still remains to be a lot of ground that we have to cover with them to frame up what are eligible projects within the town's beach. And then one within those eligible areas, what constitutes damage that we're trying to repair. But like so much of our beach works, the funding is secure, and we are advancing, doing what we think is necessary to protect those properties.
And the last question, after the Renourishment, how wide do you anticipate the beach being in front of Gray Wood at high tide?
I think it's an additional couple hundred feet. I mean, what we're trying to do
Past the dune that y'all...
is replicate the conditions that existed prior to the storm. In long term, I realize it doesn't answer the question now about what the habits and behaviors of people are there now, but it would be my expectation that long term, you all reclaim possession of that private property just like you did beforehand. It's just going to take a little bit of time for you as impacted and benefiting property owners to kind of retrain yourself to today's normal, and the beachgoers, I think, to understand what their new normal is until that larger scale project happens. But yeah, we want to push that out a couple hundred feet.
I'd like to add one thing about the goal of what we're trying to do with restoring that project. Scott touched on the idea of trying to get permits as quickly as possible. If we're expanding the scope, the simplest way to do that is to go to the agencies and say, we're just going to restore what we lost during this event. But if we start expanding the scope of that to widen the beach, the level of questioning and scrutiny on that application and that request becomes much more involved. So what we're trying to do is to make it as quick as possible. So I wouldn't expect that what we replace back is going to be measurably larger than what was there prior to the storm. That's going to be our goal anyway with the agencies.
Yes, I walk the beach every day in the morning, and that shelf that extends out from Gray Widgeon and the rest of the places, when the tide gets to be 9 feet, 8.5 to 9 feet, there is no beach. You've got to go up on the shelf, and I think the property line comes out from those houses maybe halfway out on the shelf or something like that. So is the town going to help establish where the property line is?
Now, it would be up to the private property owners to reestablish their corners. Given the current discussion that we're involved with now with FEMA and these worksheets, not sure that I would recommend that we place a bunch of no trespassing private property signs within the limits of the project that we're working on. But no, we don't intend to undertake really what's a private property issue down there with restoring those corners and restoring the limits of those properties.
So we can still walk the beach when the tide comes up to that mound.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily dissuade you from doing that.
All right.
For the benefit of the East Beach Lagoon residents, whom I'm hoping will be watching this video, they're concerned about the area where the Renourishment stops between South and East Beach Lagoon. Can you go into a little more detail about that? Because I know one of the property owners, I think you probably talked to him, thinks that where the Renourishment stops, whatever is past that is going to get some repercussion of that. I'm assuming it's not going to just drop off, that it will level out. But
yeah, there are tapers both in plan form and vertically for how the project would taper in. And one of the I'll call it cocktail circuit discussions that seems to be going on is a correlation that has inaccurately been represented, that the damage that was sustained at marsh wren, gray widgeon, and piping plover was a result of the town's prior project from August. That, hey, if I'm on the outside looking in and you build your project, I will be disadvantaged just because you stopped your project where you did. That is factually inaccurate. And in fact, I guess I would point to the fact that prior to this storm, we had 9 other end areas of our project, right? With no such impact. We do think that there was a commingling of wind and wave and current issues that came to play there, given the proximity of that location to the mouth of Calabogie Sound, the timing and the passage of the storm that I made mention of. The other thing that occurred down there, we believe, that as those structures became eroded out of the face of the beach, the vertical walls, that may have further exacerbated the conditions because of the reflection that went on as those waves bounced off the face of those pools, that kind of created a circumstance that just fed on itself. But we are prepared, maybe not today, to speak to that. I do understand that there is some misinformation, let's say, that we may need to combat, that basically if you're at an end of our projects, that you are necessarily disadvantaged, and it's just not true.
I believe the state setbacks are coming up to get remapped. Do you anticipate anywhere in Sea Pines that setback line is going to change?
I don't know. It is at planning. 2017 is the prescribed time during which the state would revisit those lines. But yeah, I don't know what the potential impact might be to their lines, our projects, the impacts from the storm. I would like to think that the storm, just because of its episodic nature, isn't going to have a long-term impact, good or bad. It was an episode that has passed, but I don't know really what to expect from their work here in 2017.
after we went through our setback line issue in Beach Lagoon and Surf Scoter, that OCRM gave the town of Hilton Head the right to establish the setback line issue. Is that not true? Or because what Curtis Coltrane fought for was the fact that we did renourishment, and therefore the OCRM would just sort of let us do our thing. Is that not the
I mean, I would
case?
describe it differently in that because of the town's dissatisfaction regarding the state's control lines and what they otherwise would have afforded or not, the town established its own control lines that are still in place today. There was really no authority that was vested in the town by the state. We just, like so many other issues around here, wanted to take possession of our own destiny. And so frankly, what happens as it relates to those state's control lines become a little bit obviated by the existence of the town's control lines that are very clear as to what can occur within each of those two zones. The oceanward-most zone, which basically limits construction to walkways only, and the buffer, the barrier behind that line that limits construction basically to flat work, swimming pools, ancillary construction, but no structures per se. And Rocky, I don't know if you want to expand on that further, but I think we're in good shape as it relates to our lines and our ability to control lines of development.
Well, will you be monitoring this closely in 2017 and go to bat for us
Among other
early
things,
on?
I'm sure it will be of interest to the town. Yes, ma'am.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
David, behind you.
the Sea Pines Beach Renourishment project that you talked about that you're working on between East Beach Lagoon and Bald Eagle, you're working hard to get it permitted, and you hope to start late winter and maybe get it done get it started and finish it by early or mid-spring. Is that what I heard you say?
That is, it's a relatively short duration project, something conceivably that may be able to happen in something less than a month.
And you have, in weeks is going to do it, or you're trying to get them?
Yeah, we have requested that they provide us a proposal, since they have equipment and men here now, what it would cost to just continue their work, break down from where they're working in Palmetto Dunes, set up shop there in Sea Pines, and continue to build that beach for us. And that's the response that we're awaiting from them. We requested this a couple of weeks ago. We're running these two paths coincidentally. We've got a public notice that's out right now, so there won't be any action as it relates to the regulatory perspective for many weeks into to 2017. The due date for public comments is January the 14th to the state.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay. Again, this is the first of what we hope to be a series of community meetings about the projects, about dune restoration and the beach topics. As more information comes out, we actually reached out to OCRM and asked for a representative to be available today. They could not make that happen. We're going to try to get that done after the beginning of the year, so hopefully we can get additional guidance from OCRM on any kind of changes they may make or application of how a beach walk might be applicable, or plantings, those types of things. So we hope to bring those forward to you at the beginning of the year. So with that, Amanda, do we have additional announcements?
So if you do not, for some reason, already receive our email updates from CSA, please see me after the meeting, and I'd be happy to take your information from you. Or alternatively, you can email us at info, it's info, at csacpines.com. That will come to me. I'm Amanda Jones, your Director of Communications. I'll be happy to get your information updated. As Brett mentioned, we will be posting this video on our website, as well as sending it out through our email communication systems. So we look forward to getting this information to you guys.
I'd like to thank Scott, Chris, and Rocky for attending today. They're a great resource for us. Certainly, as you can tell, they've been doing a lot of work to try to get this restored, and I anticipate we're going to be doing a lot more work to improve those dunes as we go forward and the beach. Thanks, everybody, for coming out.